So Tucker interviewed Jeffrey Sachs, former neoliberal establishment economist in good standing turned renegade. And Sachs had some very interesting things to say about the New York Times. And so somebody like Jeffrey Sachs just breaking away from the establishment and turning on them is particularly valuable because look, you got schmucks like us that can only speculate based on pretty good evidence, but we can only speculate on what really goes on inside the New York Times. Jeffrey Sachs really knows what goes on inside the New York Times. And what he says here is something we all know, but it's still fascinating to hear it from somebody who knows firsthand.
But why
And
would the New York Times be parroting the security state?
well, I think that's a question that goes back decades, partly because it's staffed in part by probably people from the intelligence agencies. We've known that for years. I don't
Work
know
at the New York Times.
who but we know in the past that CIA just had reporters on the payroll. I mean, whether they do or not now, I have no idea. So I'm not making a current claim, but we know that that's a historic fact. We know historically that with very rare exceptions, the New York Times has just followed uh, the unnamed official sources. That this is the whole MO. This patriotic newspaper. It follows what it's told to do. And it doesn't ask questions. It has not asked any questions about any of these wars in recent memory, not about Ukraine, not about the wars raging throughout the Middle East. As I said, I think there was one full page actually about Operation Timber Sycamore in 2016. You would think that something that got us into a war of 13 years where we spent billions of dollars, where hundreds of thousands of people died, even at this stage, there would be a kind of page or a box explaining the historical background to this, but it didn't exist. I actually wrote, I have to say, I wrote to one of the reporters saying, couldn't you mention a little background? Said, oh, very interesting idea, Mr. Sachs. So I'm waiting.
You wrote to a New York Times reporter.
Well, I know these people for decades.
Yeah.
And by the way, I not only do I know them, and some I like very much, by the way, and some have been classmates of mine a long time ago, and they know things that they don't report, and that's also important to understand that what they will say in private is the opposite of what their newspaper says, and I mean literally the opposite.
Now, that is just a fascinating part of that interview. The whole interview is well worth watching. I would really recommend it. This is what we suspect but can't prove. And here you have somebody with firsthand knowledge that these reporters, they know better. They know that they're putting out propaganda. I've mentioned when I went to see Taibbi give a lecture in Brooklyn, afterwards, there was a little clutch of people around him waiting to meet him. And he said there are 7 reporters that everyone knows works for the CIA, so much so that when you see certain headlines, you don't have to see the byline. You know one of the 7 wrote that article.
Right.
I asked him subsequently if he could name those people, and I think he's worried about getting sued if he did. But I take him at his word, and here's Sachs basically confirming that. He's careful to say, I don't know if that's still true. I think we can assume that that's true. Do you want to add anything before we go on to the article?
Well, yeah, I mean, just when it comes to that, because you have to think, okay, there's got to be something bigger than them bearing down on them. The New York Times, it's not like us. It's not like indie media creators. You know, we are basically like Uber drivers, right? I mean, yes, we're independent, but we're Uber drivers in the sense that we're on a platform. We need the platform to reach the audience. And platforms have rules. There's censorship. This is why we build our Rumble channel the way we do, because they're a free speech platform. But when we're here in East Berlin, there are certain stories that we either can't cover or we have to cover in very specific ways, like the Luigi one, right? We have to be very, very careful and issue all kinds of disclaimers, and it's kind of a drag to do it, to be honest, because you can't just have an adult conversation without worrying about censorship. This is the New York Times. This is an institution, right? They have they're their own outlets. They can do what they want. There's a First Amendment. So if they're doing what they're doing, it must mean they're answering to somebody. They have to be answering to somebody because no one wants to engage in that censorship. Journalists don't get into it so that they can be controlled. So once you reach that point, if your content and your editorial bent is a certain way, as we're going to see in this next piece that Russ has, it's because they're answering to somebody. It's because someone is bearing down on them, just the way the indie media creators have, YouTube and Facebook bearing down on them to watch that they don't step out of line. They must have that too. And who could it be? Who could it be? They don't need these big tech platforms. The fucking New York Times. It's got to be the intelligence agencies. It's got to be the military-industrial complex. It has to be.
And
the only thing that makes any logical sense.
Well, and this is why the more you really do research, the more you really read actual books by actual experts who are not deep state operatives, the more radicalized you become. Because the more you realize that the entire mainstream narrative is no different than if you lived in a totalitarian police state where the press is literally an arm of the government. The reporting we get is that controlled. It is that circumscribed. And case in point, this just happened to drop right at the same time as this Sachs interview, but it makes his point very well. So Drop Site News, which has been doing some very good work, I must say, just dropped this article. The New York Times ignored sources' doubts about Hamas docs provided by Israel. A key source named by the New York Times as an expert helping to verify the authenticity of internal Hamas documents in a major report in October told Dropsite News he had raised concerns about the veracity of the documents in his interviews with the Times. Israel provided the paper with alleged Hamas meeting minutes as part of its campaign to directly link Iran to the planning of the October 7th attacks. Salah al-Din al-Awawda, whom the paper described as, quote, a Hamas member and a former fighter in its military wing who is now an analyst based in Istanbul, said a Times reporter only permitted him to review one page of the 30 pages of documents the Times asked him to verify. Al-Awawda, I hope I'm saying that right, according to WhatsApp messages seen by Dropsite News, told a Times reporter that without seeing more of the document, it is hard to judge its authenticity. Quote, I asked for the other pages, and he said he couldn't send them to me, but he said he could read them to me at a later time, and I told him that wouldn't work. If I could see the pages, it would be preferable, he told Dropsite. The Times never provided Al-Awada with additional pages and subsequently cited him in an October 12th story as the only named source for its verification of what it described as, quote, minutes of Hamas's secret meetings that provide a detailed record of the planning for the October 7th terrorist attack. Okay, so in spite of the fact, according to this, in spite of the fact that he told them he hadn't seen enough, they quoted him as a source that verified the documents. Al-Awada said he told the Times that he did not believe the alleged Hamas meetings were specifically about the October 7th plans, and that he doubted Iran or any other outside forces were informed in advance of the plot. Nonetheless, the story was published with the headline, Secret Documents Show Hamas Tried to Persuade Iran to Join its October 7th Attack. So this is the newspaper of record, the New York Times. They literally had the source tell them, I doubt this is authentic. I would need to see more to verify. And they still not only ran with that headline, but claimed that he had verified it by name.
Yep.
By name.
That's how you end up like CNN doing the Syria jail story. Like,
right.
Right.
Well,
intentional carelessness.
They're working for the intelligence services.
Right.
That is what Sachs points out. Although he says he doesn't know presently, he knows that was the case in the past. When you look at this kind of reporting, why would they do it this way?
Right.
And what he does say is they know better. They
Right.
know better. Notably, the Times did not address DropSite's questions about the authenticity of the documents in response to a request for comment. The story, quote, involved multiple reporters speaking to numerous people in order to understand, corroborate, and contextualize the documents referenced, Times spokesperson Charlie Statlander said in a statement. This work did not just interpret the sensitive documents themselves, but also reported from multiple angles on the real life events and entities involved. It's an exhaustive and deeply reported piece of independent journalism. Mr. Alwawada, I'm sorry. Let me take a second. Mr. Al-Awada. Would you say that's right? Probably.
Awoda.
See,
Yeah, I
it's
would
that
guess so.
extra W that's
That extra
throwing me.
W is probably silent. At least we'll say it is. Ignorant
Mr.
Westerners that we are.
Awade.
Yeah.
Awade, right? Because it's
Awade. There we go.
DEH.
Awade. I like that. I like that. Yeah. I like that.
All right, we're going to run with that. Mr. We don't mean any disrespect. These kinds of names are unfamiliar to us. Mr. Awade was just one of the numerous people consulted in the course of reporting to offer context and was not the sole or even primary means of understanding the contents of the documents. The Times, however, stated that it consulted Al-Awade specifically to assess their authenticity. So basically, they did a big dance to avoid the reality that they attributed confirmation to this guy that he never in fact gave. Okay, you had other people confirmed it. Who are they? Who confirmed it? This episode, along with other reports published in the Times and other major U.S. and international news organizations, raises serious questions about the extent to which powerful media organizations have permitted Israel to launder its agenda in Gaza. Throughout the past 14 months, news organizations have crafted stories based on unverified Israeli assertions and intelligence that have bolstered Israel's strategic messaging and propaganda campaigns that often accompany its escalation of brutality and killing in Gaza. Last week, the New York Times published a major article headlined "Records Seized by Israel Show Hamas Presence in UN Schools," alleging that at least 24 UNRWA employees working as educators in schools run by the UN agency in Gaza were members of Hamas, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that nearly all of the UNRWA personnel linked to Hamas were fighters in the group's armed wing, the Qassam Brigades. The paper based the claims on secret Hamas military plans that showed that the Qassam brigades regarded schools and other civilian facilities as the best obstacles to protect the resistance in the group's asymmetric war with Israel, unquote. The Times story does not mention that Israel's previous allegations that UNRWA is a front group for Hamas have been repeatedly debunked. In a statement to DropSite News, an UNRWA spokesperson pointed to the fact that the Times admits it did not independently authenticate the alleged records. Quote, "These articles can only be seen as feeding into a blanket claim that UNRWA is a terrorist organization, something that is unheard of in the history of the UN," said UNRWA spokesperson Tamara Al-Rafai. "We have had several instances since the war started in Gaza with a few reputable media outlets covering the claims against UNRWA in an utterly unprofessional and mostly irresponsible way, putting the lives of our own staff at risk while they are racing against time to distribute food, manage shelters, and fix water pumps during the fighting." The Times wrote it could not authenticate the records provided to the paper directly by the Israeli military, but instead justified publishing their claims by saying that the documents, quote, "bear similarities with other Hamas records that the Times has examined." DropSite asked the Times which previous Hamas documents it was referring to, and Statlander did not reply. In other words, it's just a bunch of horse shit. This is why nobody trusts the media at this point, and they'll spill endless ink smearing Rumble, for example, and other competitors for people's consumption of news, that in the end certainly are not doing a worse job. And even when maybe you don't agree with a take, or maybe you feel these outlets get something wrong, it is less often that I look at an independent commentator, even one that I might ideologically disagree with, and feel that they are literally lying, making things up, working for government agencies and outlets. Now, what Sachs lays out there, that you have intelligence agents probably still working in these organizations. And as I said, Taibbi, without reservation, said that there are CIA operatives working at these media outlets. I mean, some of them are just open. You watch MSNBC or CNN, you have people who have
It's
formerly,
on their resume. They put it on the Chiron.
it's on their
Yeah.
resume. A lot of them are working for defense contractors, and they
Right.
usually don't disclose that. And he said that these reporters know better, which one would assume. One would assume if you're smart enough to write for the New York Times, you're probably smart enough to know what you're writing for the New York Times is not true. These are just propaganda outlets. And that is why when you talk to your liberal aunt about international geopolitics, Putin is the greatest living threat on the planet, and the United States is a victim of badly led countries. We don't hate the people, but all these countries have terrible leadership, except for us. We have great leadership. This is why. All of the news about international geopolitics is designed to manufacture consent for the agenda that Wesley Clark revealed, that Sachs mentions there. They planned on taking out these 7 countries. That was the agenda. Syria was the next to last on the list. And now, why do you think you're hearing so much about Iran? And that is not something you're just hearing from Harris, the Biden-Harris administration. That's not something you're just hearing from the Democrats. If anything, Trump and his crew are screaming that even more loudly than they were.
Please clap.